Hi class, welcome to Chapter 3, Digestion, Absorption, and Transport. So in this chapter, we are going to be talking about what happens to the nutrients and the foods when we eat them. Some things to think about. What do you think of the phrase, you are what you eat? Is it true? Why or why not? I think this is partly true for sure. And we're going to learn a little bit about digestion and absorption today and why. And then what happens to the food once you swallow it. So our body's able to use that food for energy, for building blocks, use it as vitamins and minerals to build new cells, new hair, new skin, etc. And in order to do that, we have to first digest it and then absorb it. And what we don't need is usually excreted. Some definitions to know. So digestion. Digestion is the process by which food is broken down into absorbable units. Absorption, the uptake of nutrients by the cells of the small intestine for transport into either the blood or the lymph. And I will make one note about this absorption definition. It does say into the cells of the small intestine, but some absorption can take place elsewhere. It's not 100% in the small intestine. However, it's primarily in the small intestine. GI tract. The GI tract stands for gastrointestinal tract. And if you think about the gastrointestinal tract, it's really a tube through our bodies. The beginning is the mouth and the end is the anus, or where we excrete our stool. This is a picture of the GI tract from start to finish, and it is important for you to know each of these organs as well as what happens in each organ. So it starts at the mouth and then it ends at the anus. For your quiz number 3, you will have a picture that looks just like this. However, the labels will be missing, so you won't be able to see what is what, and it will be your job to label them. So you're going to have to type in answers. So I do want you to be familiar with where the parts of the digestive tract are and then what each part does. Follow that food. So food starts in the mouth when we eat. It passes through the pharynx and over the epiglottis. The epiglottis is a tiny little flap that prevents food from going into our trachea or our windpipe. It then goes through the upper esophageal sphincter. It moves down the esophagus to the lower esophageal sphincter. And the lower esophageal sphincter is what separates the esophagus from the stomach and controls the flow of food from the esophagus to the stomach, and also prevents food from coming back up from the stomach into the esophagus. Once it's in the stomach, it moves through the stomach. At the end of the stomach is the pyloric sphincter. The pyloric sphincter allows food to pass to the small intestine. There are 3 parts of the small intestine: the duodenum, jejunum, and ileum. From the ileum, it will move through the ileocecal valve. This controls the flow into the large intestine. It will move through the large intestine to the rectum and then out the anus if there's anything to excrete. So in the mouth, digestion actually does begin in the mouth. And there's multiple things that can happen in the mouth to aid in digestion. For example, we chew our food, and our teeth do some what's called mechanical digestion or physical digestion by breaking the food into smaller particles and increasing the surface area of the food. We also have saliva that's released into our mouth. Saliva helps dampen the food, lubricate the food so that it will flow easily through the esophagus, and deliver some flavors to us. Our tongue helps propel food to the back of our throat so that it can go down the esophagus, and there are some digestive enzymes in our saliva. In the stomach, so once food has moved from the esophagus to the stomach, there is this sphincter, which you can't see here, but it would be right here, and this would be the lower esophageal sphincter that controls food from the esophagus to the stomach and prevents backflow up into the esophagus. So it ends up in the stomach, and the stomach is a very muscular organ. The stomach has longitudinal, circular, and diagonal muscles, and the stomach works to kind of mix and churn that food. So there's a lot of mechanical digestion that's taking place in the stomach. The stomach will turn solid foods that you eat, so say you're eating crackers or carrots or apples, those are really hard, crunchy foods, into a liquid mixture. And it will do this by adding some gastric juices, as well as by churning it by the movement of the stomach. And so once it has churned this food into a liquid component, that liquid component is called chyme. Once chyme leaves the stomach, I guess I could show that right here, but as chyme leaves the stomach, it leaves through the pyloric sphincter, which would be right here, and it enters the first part of the small intestine, which is the duodenum. The intestines have different ways to move food through the intestinal tract. One method is by peristalsis, which is wave-like muscular contractions that help pass food along. There's also something called segmentation, which is a periodic squeezing or partitioning of the intestines at intervals along its length. And then we also have sphincters that can contract and open, relax to allow food to pass from different segments to other segments. So, for example, from the small intestine to the large intestine. Sphincters. So sphincters are muscles that can contract or relax to control flow of food and enzymes from one segment of the gastrointestinal tract to the other. And I've already mentioned this lower esophageal sphincter quite a bit, but the lower esophageal sphincter is at the bottom of the esophagus and the very top of the stomach. And it prohibits food from coming back up from the stomach to the esophagus, and it controls the flow of food from the esophagus into the stomach. This is a picture of the sphincter muscle, and you can see that in the esophagus, this sphincter muscle will relax when food is going to flow into the stomach, and it will contract or after food has already moved into the stomach so that no food goes back up. You don't want that to happen. What type of secretions are there in the GI tract? Well, you're probably pretty familiar with saliva. We're going to talk about that a little bit on the next slide. There's something called gastric juice, and gastric juice is made up of water, enzymes, and something called hydrochloric acid, or HCl. And gastric juice is found in the stomach and helps to form that liquid chyme, break down proteins, etc. Pancreatic juice is secreted by the pancreas, and it contains enzymes and something called sodium bicarbonate that helps neutralize the acidic gastric juice in the stomach. Bile is produced by the liver and stored in the gallbladder, and when your body senses that there are fats in your small intestine, the gallbladder will contract to release bile into that first part of the small intestine. And bile does something called emulsifying fats, which we're going to learn about in more detail coming up. So these are the salivary glands. There are 3 main salivary glands, and they secrete saliva. Saliva contains water, salts, mucus, and something called amylase enzymes. And amylase enzymes help digest some starches in our mouth. I mentioned amylase. You might have noticed that at the end of amylase was the ASE. Anytime you see a word with an ending ASE on it, that ASE indicates that that word is an enzyme. And what enzymes do is they help break down large components such as proteins or carbohydrates or lipids into smaller components, smaller little building blocks, so that we can digest them further and absorb them further. pH. So what is the pH, or kind of acidity, hydrogen ion concentration of these different components? So gastric juice is in our stomach, and this has hydrochloric acid, and our stomach is very acidic. It has a pH of 2. Our saliva is about the same pH as water, so it's very neutral. And then we have bile and pancreatic juice. And bile and pancreatic juice are slightly basic. And the reason for this is bile and pancreatic juice are secreted once food enters the small intestine to help neutralize some of this acidic chyme that will be entering into the small intestine. This is a horrible picture, I apologize, but you can find similar charts in your book. Anyways, this is looking at different enzymes and different components that aid in digestion and absorption, where they come from, what their pH level is, what they act on, and what they produce. So, for example, pancreatic amylase comes from the pancreas, has a pH 6.7 to 7. It works on polysaccharides, and it produces disaccharides and glucose. So it will break down long chains of sugars into smaller chains of sugars. Final stage of digestion. So once we have broken down these sugars, carbs, and fats into their small components, and we've broken down vitamins and minerals so that we can absorb them, what happens next? We might have some water left over, we might have some salts left over, and we might have fiber. We cannot digest fiber, and so those things go into the large intestine and are excreted. The large intestine is otherwise known as the colon, and it has some different kind of segments to it. The small intestine enters the large intestine at the ileocecal valve, which you can't really see, but it would be right around here. And so that's where the small intestine, I'll just draw, this is the small intestine, it's all curvy and stuff, enters the large intestine. Then you have something called the appendix right here. You have the ascending colon, the transverse colon, the descending colon, sigmoid colon, rectum, which is kind of where you're going to store your stool or feces, and then anus. So these are all the parts of the gastrointestinal system, again. And remember, I do want you to be familiar with this picture. What happens when we eat? So let's look at the example of eating a sandwich. A sandwich might have 2 pieces of bread, some meat, maybe some cheese, maybe some lettuce, maybe some tomato. But whatever it has in it, it probably has carbs, it has fats, it has proteins, and it probably has some fiber, especially in that bread if it's, let's just say it's whole wheat bread. So what will happen to each of these things? This is a way you can track what happens to each kind of component of that sandwich and where it happens. In the mouth, we don't have a lot of digestion happening, but we do have salivary enzymes. We also are using our teeth to kind of break down food. Fat digestion is pretty minimal in the mouth, but body temperature helps us melt fats, and proteins can be moistened by saliva. In the stomach, we're going to mix up all this food to become chyme. And so we have protease enzymes that help will digest proteins. We have gastric juice, etc. In the small intestine, this is where the majority of the absorption is going to occur. So we're going to be able to begin to absorb many of these nutrients. And then in the large intestine is where we're going to get rid of the excess fiber, excess water, and excess salts. So how do carbs, protein, fat, vitamins and minerals, and water go from the digestive tract into our body? And we're going to find out. They are generally absorbed across cells, primarily cells of the small intestine. Then they can travel into the lymph or the blood. And if they do travel into the lymph, they are eventually recirculated into the blood. Absorption. So I think we've discussed this already, but absorption primarily happens in the small intestine. The small intestine has a very large surface area. It's 10 feet in length, and the surface area is equivalent to a tennis court. How is this 10-foot intestine equivalent to the size of a tennis court? Well, it's lined with these finger-like projections called villi and microvilli. And the villi and microvilli of the small intestine significantly increase its absorptive capacity. These are some pictures of the villi and microvilli. So within the small intestine, you have these folds, and on each of these folds is a villi. And then on each of these villi are tiny little microvilli. And it's through these microvilli that nutrients can be absorbed, and they can be absorbed either into the bloodstream or into the lymphatic vessels. Crypts between the villi of the intestine, there are something called crypts, and crypts are spaces where intestinal juices can be secreted. How do we absorb nutrients across these cells? So there are three main routes of absorption. The first one is simple diffusion, and in simple diffusion, nutrients can pass freely across cells. There's no energy required, no transport molecule required, nothing like that. In facilitated diffusion, which is seen in the middle here, a nutrient needs a carrier to help bring it across the cell membrane. And so they absolutely need this carrier. In active transport, not only does the nutrient need a carrier to help bring it across the cell membrane, but it also requires energy. And so energy is used to pass nutrients across cell membranes in active transport. After these nutrients are absorbed, where do they go? Well, I mentioned they go either to the blood or the lymph. And the lymph is housed in these in what's called a lacteal. So in this lacteal and this kind of greenish fluid, this is part of the lymphatic system. And the lymph fluid is actually kind of a yellowish greenish fluid. This other part where you see blue and red, this is part of our circulatory system. So some molecules can be absorbed into our circulatory system, into our bloodstream, and other molecules can be absorbed or must be absorbed into our lymph. Fats, large fats and fat-soluble vitamins, they're not soluble in water, and our blood is most similar to water. So large fats and fat-soluble vitamins are absorbed through the lymph, and they travel in something called chylomicrons, which I like to say are little fat taxis and help carry these large fats and fat-soluble vitamins through the lymph. Smaller fats actually can cross into our bloodstream, and so are absorbed that way. Circulatory systems. So we have our vascular system, which is our blood, and we have our lymphatic system, and we'll talk about these a little bit. Our vascular system involves arteries, capillaries, and veins. I always thought about art as away from the heart. So arteries carry blood away from the heart. Veins carry blood back to the heart, and capillaries are the smallest of vessels that branch out from the arteries and connect them to the brain, the veins, not the brains. There is a figure 8 blood flow, and the blood goes from the heart to the arteries to the capillaries to the veins to the heart. In the digestive system, it goes from the heart to the arteries to the capillaries to the portal veins to the capillaries and liver to the hepatic vein to the heart. And that can be illustrated in this diagram here. Lymphatic system. So I highly recommend you watch this video. It really helps explain the lymphatic system. But the lymphatic system is a second kind of circulatory system, and it's organized of vessels and ducts that help move fluid towards the heart. And specifically, The lymphatic system is used to transport large fats and fat-soluble vitamins. Lymph. I already mentioned it was kind of this yellowish, greenish fluid, and it's very similar to blood, but it does not have any red blood cells or platelets, so it doesn't clot and it doesn't carry oxygen, and it's used to transport these fats and fat-soluble vitamins. Nutrients in lymph. So, nutrients in lymph, the fats and fat-soluble vitamins are absorbed across the intestinal wall into the lymph. So, fats and fat-soluble vitamins cannot be absorbed directly into the bloodstream. At first, they bypass the liver, where the bloodstream does go directly to the liver, and they're carried up towards the heart. Then they can mix back in with our blood. So this is a picture of the liver and how the liver can kind of send nutrients, get nutrients from the intestines, bring them to the liver, etc. So you can read more about that here. The liver is not necessarily part of the GI tract, but it's considered what's called an accessory organ because having a liver is key to the function of the GI tract. So what is the goal of our GI tract? Our goal is to keep things balanced and avoid drastic change. And a word that can be used to describe this is homeostasis. The microbiome. So maybe you've heard a little bit about the microbiome, but the microbiome is a word to describe the bacteria that actually colonize our body. It can be bacteria, viruses, fungi, protozoa, etc. And the microbiome can be found on the skin, in the mouth, in the genital tract, and also the GI tract. However, the majority of the microbiome, these bacteria and viruses and fungi, are found in the gastrointestinal tract. And we're learning more and more about them every day, but they may play a role in everything from Alzheimer's disease to obesity to diabetes to even possibly autism. In addition to their role, they help us digest some undigestible nutrients, and they can produce some vitamins. So there are about 10 trillion of them, and most of them are good. They actually help protect us from pathogenic bacteria invading our gastrointestinal tracts. And if you're interested, you can actually have your microbiome analyzed. So you can send off a stool sample. There's a couple different companies that do it, and they'll give you a complete breakdown of what bacteria are found in your intestinal tract and kind of how those bacteria relate to health. So it's really, really interesting. All right. What would happen if the body could not control the rate at which food traveled from the mouth through the intestines? Well, you can kind of see what might happen in this little cartoon here. But in addition to food flowing too quickly, not being absorbed, causing diarrhea, you wouldn't be able to get the nutrients and get the energy from food because you wouldn't have time for nutrients to pass across the cells. How is digestion controlled? So digestion is controlled by the hormonal system as well as the nervous system. There are nerve receptors in the stomach wall that actually respond to the presence of food and cause gastric glands to secrete the gastric juices and cause the stomach to contract. When the stomach empties, there are additional receptors. I had to cough. There are receptors that will tell the gastric glands to stop secreting hydrochloric acid because the stomach is now empty. Hormones. So hormones are chemical messengers, and they're secreted by a variety of glands in response to different conditions. And hormones generally can travel through the bloodstream, and so they may act on the organ that secretes them, or they may act on a different organ. So between the nervous system and the hormonal system, the goal of both of these is to help maintain something called homeostasis or balance within this gastrointestinal tract. So how does this balance be maintained? Well, for example, it's important to maintain an acidic pH in the stomach because that acidic pH helps break down food into chyme as well as break down protein. And so when food enters the stomach, it causes release of gastrin. And gastrin is a hormone that causes the stomach cells to release hydrochloric acid that help maintain that pH. All right, as chyme enters the intestine, the pancreas adds bicarbonate so that the intestinal contents remain slightly alkaline. How does it know how much to add? Well, the presence of this chyme in the intestine causes the cells of the intestine to release a hormone called secretin. And secretin causes the pancreas to release bicarbonate. Sorry, I'm having some coughing attacks. When fat is present in the intestine, the gallbladder contracts to squirt bile into the intestine to emulsify the fat. How does the gallbladder get the message that the fat is present? Fat in the intestine stimulates the intestinal cells to release something called CCK or cholecystokinin, and CCK causes the bile to be released from the gallbladder. When is the system working at its best? So your GI tract will work at its best when you get good sleep, when you're active, when you're mentally healthy, and depending on the type of meals you eat. So you need balance, moderation, variety, and adequacy. Highlight. We're going to talk about some common digestive problems. Actually, we're mostly going to focus on just a couple of them, but you can read more about all of these in your book. So swallowing and choking. Normally, when we swallow food, we form what's called a bolus of food. And this bolus is kind of a cohesive unit of food that can be passed through the esophagus. What should happen when we swallow is that the larynx will rise, and this little flap right here, called the epiglottis, closes, and the epiglottis prevents food from going down here, which is the trachea. When we choke, this epiglottis doesn't close like it did in the other picture, and food goes down the trachea towards the lungs. And so that's when we choke. Gastroesophageal reflux. Gastroesophageal reflux happens when acid from the stomach, or acid along with food contents from the stomach, splashes up through the lower esophageal sphincter into the esophagus. And this can happen when the lower esophageal sphincter isn't closing properly or it's weak. There's many other factors that can contribute to this as well. But what happens is your esophagus will become damaged because your esophagus doesn't have mucosal cells to protect it from that acidic chyme in the stomach. The stomach can protect itself, but your esophagus can't. So this can be very painful and in severe cases even lead to esophageal cancer. This is a summary of some common GI problems that you could read about further in your book. And here's the quiz. So the semi-liquid, partially digested food that travels through the intestinal tract is called, hopefully you guessed, chyme, C. Muscular contractions that move through food through the GI tract are called, C again, peristalsis. The main function of bile is to A, emulsify fats. The pancreas neutralizes stomach acid in the small intestine by secreting D, bicarbonate. Which of the following passes through the GI tract mostly undigested and absorbed? B, fiber. Absorption occurs primarily in the small intestine. All blood leaving the GI tract travels first to the liver. Which nutrients leave the GI tract by way of the lymphatic system? Fats and fat-soluble vitamins. Digestion and absorption are coordinated by the hormonal system and nervous system. Gastrin, secretin, and cholecystokinin are examples of hormones. And now your homework is to eat fiber, 25 to 35 grams a day. All right, I hope you enjoyed that lecture, and I will talk to you next time. Thanks, bye.